founding member of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. Peter's been working for decades to surface the sexual violence that's been happening within the church and really challenge the system that has perpetuated this. And he is a hero and really one of the many people who have made a lot of personal sacrifices in doing this for decades. I'm going to speak about two cases that we're working on in which we are trying to surface the core of the harms in when religion is used either to shield really serious human rights violations like rape and sexual violence, and then another case where religious liberty has been weaponized, basically, as Patty was talking about in the LGBTI context in Uganda. I'm first going to talk about a case that we brought on behalf of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests in September of 2011. We brought a complaint to the International Criminal Court prosecutor seeking an investigation and prosecution of high-level Vatican officials for their role in forming and implementing policies and practices that really allow this violence to flourish within the church. The thing we know now in 2013, thanks in large part to the efforts of the network that Peter's involved with and survivors in other countries who've been coming forward and pushing for commissions of inquiry or grand juries over the last decade and a half, is that no one can say this isn't happening, right? It is clear that this is happening everywhere the church has a presence. And we know this because there have been a number of commissions of inquiry in Ireland, Canada, Austria, Belgium. There have been grand juries here in the United States that have looked at this over a period of years. And it's not just the fact that the sexual violence is happening. It's what they have all uncovered are the same policies and practices that have allowed for the cover-ups and have actually required the covering up of this violence, and have the ways in which the Holy See has worked to shield itself from accountability in national systems. One of the things that we've done recently is filed a alternative report with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child last week. We've got that here. If you want to look at it, it sort of takes into account the status of where things stand now and what we know and what the Holy See has represented to the committee. But one of the key things to understand about this case and why we brought it is that when you look at the wealth of evidence out there, it's shocking. And we've spent three and a half years working on this. We spent almost a year and a half before we ever even filed it. And the magnitude and scope of what is going on out there is astonishing. And it's still happening. It's not a thing of the past. One of the things that is often said is that here in the U.S., after scandals broke out in 2002, the bishops undertook a policy reform and that there's a zero tolerance policy here. But what grand juries that have looked at this and have taken testimony and as recently as 2011 have said that those policies are masking the same those new policies are masking the same practices. That the same thing is still happening. And what's more, those policies just simply make it more difficult to actually get at what's going on because you'll have an independent review board set up as part of these policy reforms. And that independent review board will supposedly do its job and say that, yes, the diocese is conforming to its policy. And then a grand jury looks at it and finds that there are still, in the case of the Philadelphia Archdiocese, 37 credibly accused priests openly serving in ministry with access to children and vulnerable adults. And that's after it's been certified as complying with a zero tolerance policy. So it's not a thing of the past, it's still happening. Ireland has found something similar, even after reforms were implemented supposedly in the late 90s. And then there are places around the world where these scandals haven't been able to bubble up yet to the surface for whatever reason in any particular context. So we brought it to the ICC prosecutor, and one of the reasons we felt we needed to do that is because here you have a church, a religious entity which calls itself a state and has diplomatic relations with, it's second only to the United States in the number of countries it has diplomatic relations with. It is a, it's a country. It will, the Vatican is a sovereign state, it will say, but yet it's operating within and alongside other states. And it has none of the same recourses that we have in our countries, with government due process issues, redress, that sort of thing. There's no way, as a person who's harmed by a church employee or priest, that you have any real rights in that system. The other thing is that what was really important to do is to really clearly state that these are acts of rape and sexual violence. The word abuse tends to smooth off the edges of what we're talking about. If you get a chance to read the report that we did last week, and I've also brought just a few copies of the complaint we filed with the International Criminal Court, which goes into quite a bit more detail on what these findings are, it's really shocking. And when, in 2011, when the Ireland's Minister of Children's Affairs spoke, she said it would be shocking to us if it happened to prisoners of war, the kinds of things we're talking about, much less children, right? And one of the things that was so astonishing to me the deeper I got into this is the degree, and I think Peter can talk about this a bit more. There's so much focus in the media around the sort of a gendered focus in terms of who's impacted by this, and there's much less focus on women and girls, but it is astounding too. And the irony in all of this is that I can't tell you how many cases we've come across where, and one of them is mentioned in the Shadow Report, where a priest had sexually assaulted an 11-year-old who then gets pregnant, and he takes her for the abortion. That is something that has come out in other contexts as well. In Alaska, for instance, there were cases there where that happened, and the diocese knew about it. One of the people who joined Peter and I in The Hague when we filed this case, Rita Mila, she was sexually assaulted by 7 priests in Los Angeles, became pregnant, and the sort of ringleader priest was trying to convince her to get an abortion, but she had actually been planning to be a nun, which is also not uncommon in many of these cases, and had a hard time getting her head around the church teachings around that, and yet these priests were telling her she should get an abortion. Her story goes on. She ends up getting whisked away to the Philippines, and her parents don't know what's going on, and she almost dies there, but eventually has the baby. A paternity test later on shows that one of the priests was the father, and it turns out, we find out later, much later, that the archdiocese had been paying these priests to stay out of the country, out of the state and out of the country, to avoid any, because she had brought a civil case later. Once her family found out, they brought a civil case, and there were attempts to investigate it. So they were actually instructing these priests to stay out of the country, and they were paying them to do so. That archbishop is now Cardinal Mahoney, who's actually in Rome right now. He'll be voting on the next pope. So that's, one of the things when people say, well, art, doesn't this kind of sexual violence happen in all institutions? Yes, it does. But what makes this situation different is that you have the only entity on earth that claims to be a state, has a very tiny territory, no real citizenry, but has a global presence, and can throw its weight around in these national systems to block any efforts to hold it accountable. And what do I mean by that? I mean, when there are civil cases brought here in the U.S. or in Canada or in Ireland, the Holy See will claim sovereign immunity. It doesn't want to have its processes and practices and procedures looked at. It will also claim interference with its practice of religion in civil cases here in the U.S. And last year, a Missouri Supreme Court, a Missouri Appellate Court, agreed with them and said if we can't look into how the Holy See or this diocese is handling priests accused of sexual violence, because that would be us interfering with their religious practice. And the Supreme Court basically let it stand. They didn't take it up. So that's a victim of sexual violence by a priest whose recourse in any means of redress has been stopped in its tracks. One of the other things they'll do is fight very hard for any sort of statute of limitations reform. There's been a lot of money going into these battles in states here in the U.S., for example, where the bishops are really fighting against any sort of window that would open up a means of redress for these types of harms to victims who've been suffering with it for decades. When we filed the case, and I should say that often many people who have any sort of reference point for the International Criminal Court think of it as a war crimes court. It's a court that has jurisdiction over war crimes, but also genocide and crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity do not need to occur in the context of a conflict. The rape and sexual violence are included in the ICC statute as crimes against humanity, and when they are committed on a widespread or systematic basis. Now, the irony is that I had been involved, as was my co-counsel in this case, in the negotiations toward the ICC from 1997 to 2003. And in that context, we were fighting to ensure that rape and other forms of sexual violence would be recognized as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And one of the biggest obstacles to that recognition was, of course, the Holy See. And at one point in the negotiations, when we were working on defining the crimes and defining the thresholds for what would constitute a crime against humanity, there were a number of states, and it's the usual suspects who line up and we're trying to push this idea that if it's happening within the context of culture or religion, that they were basically trying to carve out an exception in the International Criminal Court statute for that. The Holy See was in the background. And we wonder, and there were even discussions that somebody sent around a flyer at one point that be careful because you could have marital rape outlawed if you go with a broad understanding of crimes against humanity, as though that would be a bad thing. And I think that was circulated by Concerned Women for America. So we sort of, nobody really knew at that time the scale and magnitude of what the church was hiding back then. We now know, thanks again to survivors, because it certainly wasn't the church that came forward with this. Thanks to survivors and advocates in different countries that were bringing all of these things to the surface, we now know they were sitting on a powder keg. And were already thinking along the lines of protecting themselves from this type of action. Subsequent to filing the case, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests has heard from people in 64 different countries. Survivors have been reaching out. One of the things we said that was so key in all of this is if we even reach one survivor somewhere around the world who then feels less alone with what happened to them, all of this is worth it. We didn't know how the experts were going to respond. We didn't know how the media was going to respond, but we thought if we just reach one survivor. And hundreds have come forward. And SNAP now has members in 64 different countries, and they are, working to build support systems for them. There are chapters in Australia, Canada, Chile, Germany, Mexico, and Peru now, and it's really becoming a survivor-led global movement for accountability, which is one of the most exciting and inspiring things I've ever seen. I'm happy to answer questions about the ICC at a certain point later on. I'll move on to the Committee on the Rights of the Child now, because it's important that the Holy See ratified it in the early 90s and filed its initial report in 94. No mention whatsoever of any kind of child sexual abuse and what they might be doing about it. It was the Holy See ratifying this important treaty, serving as a model for everyone else around the world and encouraging other countries to do the same. and basically lauding everything it says and does around children's rights. Fast forward to 2013, now they've been summoned to report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and it's a completely different scenario. Still, they minimize in their report, I think only 6 paragraphs out of the entire report on the optional protocol for the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography actually reference it in some way, but not in any depth, and it's more of what we see when there are supposed apologies happening, which actually don't take full responsibility for what's happened and actually sort of share the blame with lowers the crisis of sexual morality or secularism in society. That's the kinds of apologies that they've given. Well, the other thing they represented to the Committee on the Rights of the Child is that, yes, they have their canon law process and canonical prosecutions, which are not intended to usurp the means of redress in civil systems and national systems. That's a misrepresentation because, as I said earlier, they're running blocks on any efforts to get accountability for the Vatican's role in these policies and practices that actually facilitate the rape and sexual violence. Again, through asserting sovereign immunity, through relying on religious liberty to shield against a supposed state interference in that practice, and fighting statute of limitations reforms. The other way you see that expressed, that policy expressed, is through people in the hierarchy at the Vatican. So, for instance, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who is now Vatican Secretary of State, very influential in what's happening there now, basically made a statement a few years ago where he said bishops should not be required to report even admitted sex offending priests to the police. That would violate the sanctity of their relationship with their priest son, and it's no one's business, basically. So he's against mandatory reporting of even admitted priests. Another cardinal who was very powerful in Rome, head of the Congregation for the Clergy at one point, said basically the same thing, but he did it with the authorization of Pope John Paul II when he sent a letter to a French bishop congratulating him for not having reported a priest who admitted to him that he had repeatedly raped a 10-year-old and sexually assaulted 9 other boys. That bishop ended up doing basically a suspended sentence for failing to report it, and the offending priest, I think, was sentenced to 18 years ultimately. But the point is, Castrillon Hoyos, the cardinal, wrote to him with the authorization of Pope John Paul II and said, you did the right thing, and we're sending this letter to all of the bishops' conferences around the world so they'll know how they are supposed to act in this regard as well. So that's how you see a policy emerging from the Vatican. This is not something that's just sort of happening randomly in dioceses around the world, and bishops are just not doing their job. Bishops are actually conforming to policy when they are covering up, and that's the thing we need to understand about the systemic nature of this violence. I will move on to another case. I'll pause there and happy to talk about it. I know Peter has probably a lot to say, and I'd love for you to hear from him if you have questions. But I was asked to also speak about a case we brought last year on behalf of Sexual Minorities Uganda against a person here in the U.S. who self-identifies as an evangelical minister for his role in the persecution on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in Uganda. Now, this man's name is Scott Lively. And what we learned in the course of this investigation leading up to the filing of the case is that he had actually been very deeply involved in helping and acknowledges that he really helped start the anti-gay movement in Uganda. And what we later learned is that he's really had a global persecution agenda, right? So we learned that he's been in Eastern Europe pressing for criminalizing any form of advocacy, any kind of organization that does anything positive with respect to LGBT rights. He has advocated very clearly and directly that you've got to criminalize that. You've got to silence these voices And that's in direct violation of their fundamental rights to expression, association, assembly. And we're seeing these laws that do that crop up in Russia, in Lithuania, in Moldova. There are attempts, and of course we see it in the pending legislation in Uganda. So the claim in this case is persecution on the basis of sexual orientation. Again, that's a crime against humanity and international law. We brought it under a law here in the United States, which allows non-citizens to bring these types of cases for violations of international law. It's important to note that this kind of conduct, if it were happening here in the U.S., would also be actionable under our Civil Rights Act. But because we're operating in an international setting with a foreign plaintiff and using international law, the parallel there is persecution. And persecution is defined in international law. It's defined in the ICC statute as the severe deprivation of fundamental rights on the basis of identity of the group or collectivity. That's what persecution is. And that's essentially severe discrimination, which is exactly what is being advocated here. But it's also what's happening. So in the Uganda context, we can't even wait for the law to pass because it's already being implemented. I mean, the organization's meetings are being shut down. Leaders of organizations have been arrested. So they can't meet. They can't, speak. They're being silenced even without the bill passing because they hadn't been able to get the bill to pass, right? So the violations are happening. The persecution is happening. And Scott Lively has identified himself with all of those aspects of it. And so we brought this case, and we are currently awaiting a decision from the judge as to whether it will be able to move forward. Scott Lively claimed that it should be dismissed because this is a case that is only about his speech and expressions of his belief. We've said it is not based on his speech. It's a difference between speech as the basis of a violation versus speech as evidence of a violation. And what we've said is his speech he tells us what he's doing. He tells us it's important to discriminate, and you've got to silence, you've got to criminalize, ban gay pride parades, shut them down. So he tells us this stuff. That's how we know that's what he's doing, and his colleagues and co-conspirators tell us the same thing. So that case is pending. It's important, I think, in a number of ways because it allows an organization that was bearing the brunt of a U.S.-influenced anti-gay agenda without realizing it for years until it all came to the surface. And it's happening around the world. We've discovered that this has been going on now in Belize, in Brazil, in Latin America, elsewhere in Latin America, and in Eastern Europe, as I said. And they've had a lot of time to gain a lot of ground and make some really awful things happen for people on the ground in these places. I think I'll pause there on the case. I feel like I've thrown a lot of information out at you. But I guess I want to say to all of you here, back when we were working around the ICC negotiations, and those were often paralleling the CSW sessions and the Beijing +5 processes, it was clear to me the UN is a strange place. You lose track of time, you're there late at night, you get bleary-eyed, you start early in the morning, and I just remember constantly being so reasonable about arguing for equality, right? Arguing for basic things. I remember having a conversation with one of the U.S.'s, the lead of the U.S. delegation who was heading the effort to define the crimes, and he was a attorney in the Department of Defense. He was a JAG attorney, and he actually said to me on the phone one day, he said, I think the women's movement made a big mistake when it said all non-consensual sex is rape. Because, if there's no violence and he just does it, why is that as serious as something else? And I was having that conversation over the phone, and I couldn't believe it. I got him turned around by the end of it, and he acknowledged in an open forum later on that he was wrong about that. But the point is, I've been able to be away from it for a while, and I just want to commend all of you who are here because it is a front line, and it's about basic equality, fundamental rights issues, autonomy. and you have my solidarity. And I don't have a badge, otherwise I'd go in and be with you. But if anybody wants to occupy the UN and not leave before, before you get what you want, not just what we're fighting now, but even set it higher. I have colleagues here from the center. I'm sure we'll all bring pillows and blankets and wine and food, whatever you need. We'll be handy. So thank you, and Patty, thank you for this panel.